Good evening, friends. I'm Homi Bhabha. I direct the Mahindra Humanities Center, and I am so delighted to see a very full room on a day when I feel particularly empty and emptied. In fact, I felt this morning like I did on the morning of 9/11, and there were many people who said to me, well, you know, people are referring to today as 11/9. I didn't know that, but I believe that it is certainly in circulation. So I see today and this occasion as an occasion for conversation, but also a safe space for comfort. And there are a number of us who want both things. And I want to thank Danielle Allen, Professor of Government and Director of the Edmond Safra Center for Ethics, David Laibson, Robert Goldman, Professor of Economics, and Jill Lepore, the David Woods Kemper 1941 Professor of American History. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Originally, I had suggested that we do a pre-election meeting, and I'm so relieved that we're doing a post-election meeting, because I think it would have been so much about predictions, and we know how these prognostications have been deeply problematic, and we know this in hindsight. But we are in a difficult moment today, because we're almost too late, and yet we're too early. So this is a very complex moment into which we are speaking, with which we are dealing. And I thank the three of you and all of you for having come here to hold that moment and to help us work through it. Thank you very much. I'm going to move very quickly now to our speakers, each of whom will take around 10 minutes. Then we'll have some panel discussion and open up to the audience as soon as we feel that we have laid out some of the issues that the panelists have brought and created a resonance amongst them. Questions will have to be somewhat brief and limited, because we only have this room, most unfortunately, till 7:45. We have to leave at 7:45 because they need this room for something else at 8. I apologize for this, because I would have liked to have had as many conversations, as many voices, as many views expressed on this very difficult evening. But thank you for being together with us. There's here great need for a kind of solidarity as well as deliberation. I'm most grateful to you for being with us this evening. Jill.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much to the Humanities Center for organizing this event, and for everyone coming out this evening. My media guy wanted to point out that I wanted to show this clip. I can't remember where the media fellow is. So I went to bed really early last night and was woken up in the middle of the night by a phone call that had nothing to do with the election, but was a kindly stranger who had found one of my cats. And my cats were not lost. People call in the middle of the night all the time if you ever find one of my cats, one of whom is aptly named Professor Bananas. Never call. They're outdoor cats. But in the middle of the night, I woke up and I thought, I should find out what actually happened after I went to bed. And so I was watching CNN on my phone, kind of under the covers, and I came across and I saw this clip that I thought I would begin with, because it struck me, maybe in the days of sleeplessness.
Congratulations, both of you guys.
We're not there yet.
Well, you're further than anybody said you would be. And I have enough class, and I was raised well enough to say, when you outdo,
yes, sir. Thank you.
When you outdo expectations, good for you. But there's another side of this. People have talked about a miracle. I'm hearing about a nightmare. It's hard to be a parent tonight for a lot of us. You tell your kids, don't be a bully. You tell your kids, don't be a bigot. You tell your kids, do your homework and be prepared. And then you have this outcome, and you have people putting children to bed tonight, and they're afraid of breakfast. They're afraid of, how do I explain this to my children? I have Muslim friends who are texting me tonight saying, should I leave the country? I have families of immigrants that are terrified tonight. This was many things. This was a rebellion against the elites. True, it was a complete reinvention of politics and polls, it's true. But it was also something else. We've talked about race, and we've talked about everything but race tonight. We've talked about income, we've talked about class, we've talked about region. We haven't talked about race. This was a white lash. This was a white lash against a changing country. It was a white lash against a black president in part. And that's the part where the pain comes. And Donald Trump has a responsibility tonight to come out and reassure people that he is going to be the president of all the people who he insulted and offended and brushed aside. Yeah, when you say you want to take your country back, you got a lot of people who feel that we're not represented well either. But we don't want to feel that someone has been elected by throwing away some of us to appeal more deeply to others. So this is a deeply painful moment tonight. I know it's not just about race. There's more going on than that. But race is here too. We got to talk about it.
Thanks. So I thought about that a lot today as I was imagining the kind of conversation we were going to have this evening, and how to acknowledge both the nightmare and the miracle, to think both about exaltation and about despair. And I was really struck by this question of what I was going to do this morning at breakfast time, and was heartened that one of my kids, my youngest kid who's 11, their assignment, their pre-existing assignment for today was to write a letter to one of the two candidates on the day after the election, explaining what their own hopes were for themselves and for their families and for the United States, what their hopes and dreams were, and how they would have voted if they'd been able to vote. And the only rule was that they couldn't say anything mean. And and my son reported to me that the kids had a really hard time with the assignment, this sort of dear blank assignment that they had today in elementary schools. And I'm sure it's an assignment that kids got all over the country. And it's a really important assignment and quite an inspired assignment. But the struggle that kids had with that assignment, I'm sure, at their desks with their pencils crammed into their fists, is something that I really want to pause on and think about. And where it is that the normalcy of this election, an incumbent holding 2 terms, the party of the incumbent who had 2 terms in the White House is not very likely to maintain control of the White House. It's a very natural thing for Clinton to have been defeated in that way. In many ways, the outcome is not surprising in the least. In fact, all but inevitable on those grounds historically. But it's something about the tenor of this particular election season that's so striking, and so many things that seem to have become variables that were once constants, and that sense of uncertainty that is the one, I think, quite unifying element of this last really 18-month experience of American voters, and especially, I think, of American children. So I wanted to just reflect on 3 different elements very quickly about those last 18 months. I was on sabbatical last year, and I was supposed to be writing a delightful, charming book about Charles Dickens, and I set it aside at the very beginning of my sabbatical because I felt like I should write about American politics as an American political historian, that it was too interesting a political season to pass by. And I was really interested in thinking about the ways in which our sense of the past has become foreshortened by the acceleration of communication, and especially by the acceleration of political communication. So at the same time, I decided to write a series of essays for The New Yorker about the political experience and the political history behind different elements and different political institutions during the election season. I also started writing a history of the United States because I'm teaching a new course in the spring that's a 1-semester survey of the history of the United States from 1492 to 2016. And as I was working on this book over the course of this election season, I sometimes would sort of joke, I should call my history American history from the beginning to the end, because there was this tremendous sense of looming apocalypse that was, again, a kind of unifying sentiment. When I would go report and talk to people at the conventions in Cleveland and Philadelphia, I heard from everybody the same shared sense of imminent political apocalypse. So there is a lot that's shared, and one of those things that is shared is this sense of doom, this kind of political millennialism, that redemption can only be found through apocalypse, which I think is a strange thing that we collectively subscribe to and has a really interesting past. But one of the things I really thought about this year while working essentially as a journalist, but who is trained as a historian, was the crisis of journalism that has been made manifest, that we've known about and people have followed and reported on and thought about and wrung hands over, but that has been, I think, made manifest in this election in a new and different way. It's the case as a historian that the way journalists usually approach history is they ask historians really two questions, because this is how journalists tend to think about the relationship between the past and the present. They want to know what that happened before is this moment like. And they want to know, has it ever been as bad before as it is now? And the answers that journalists tend to come up with tend to collapse the distance between the past and the present. And I think that they have a kind of pernicious fallacy that they bring to American political discourse. And it's unfortunate and it's understandable. But one of the things that's been made obvious by the dwindling of on-the-ground political reporting, especially local reporting, is that political reporting has largely been replaced with punditry. So that intellectual move of collapsing the distance between the past and the present for the sake of making a forced and false analogy is really the only move that a lot of political reporters have in terms of writing about the past. And it produces a lot of essays that are Jeremiads. If you were to think about almost anything written by David Brooks, say, is ultimately about the end of virtue, right? It's about the decline of virtue. It's a version of the decline of civility. It's a version of a kind of William Brennan argument. Or if you think about anything written by Andrew Sullivan in the last year, it's a Jeremiad. It's a declensionist narrative about the end of democracy. Sullivan had a piece this morning called The Republic Repeals Itself, which was about the end of the American Republic. That it is actually that very intellectual move that is the only move left if you're not on the ground speaking to people face to face and you want to talk about where people once were and where they are now, that creates this inevitable narrative, I think, of decline that is ultimately apocalyptic and therefore, I think, quite dangerous because it heightens political anxieties rather than addresses them or investigates them. And I don't mean here to malign journalists. I think the best political writing in the country is done by the best print journalists, honestly. But I do mean to say that there's a kind of unmooring that preceded this election, has to do with has a lot to do with changes in technology, but is at a kind of crisis point in terms of political reporters' ability to help voters understand issues and elections. Added to that disequilibrium, then, I think we can think about, and it's important to think about polling as a variety of journalism, not as a variety of social science. Polling began as a form of journalism. George Gallup, who founded the American Institute for Public Opinion Research in 1935, was a professor of journalism. He had a PhD in applied psychology, but he was a journalist and he sold his public opinion polls to newspapers. In fact, the Public Opinion Research Institute was previously called the Editor's Research Bureau. He was really just selling content to newspapers to increase their circulation. And he was trying to report on what people thought, what Americans' ideas were. And he began trying to predict elections only to prove the accuracy of his public opinion measurements, of his surveys. He actually thought, and he admitted when he started doing that predicting elections would be very bad for democracy, because it's antithetical to how a republic works, how a representative form of government works, because it's essentially supplanting representation with direct democracy. And the more you do it, and the earlier you do it, the more insidious it becomes with regard to the way in which it undermines the system of representative government that the country was founded on. So if you think about that in the way that what happened beginning in the early 1970s is that news organizations began doing their own polling when it became possible to afford an IBM mainframe computer. The New York Times and CBS did its first public opinion election prediction in 1975. And people at the time said it's actually not okay for newspapers to be reporting to be conducting polls, because they're creating and manufacturing news instead of analyzing news. And it was a really big debate at the time, a debate on about the ethics of journalism. But it was incredibly successful by way of circulation. And polling has been growing ever since. So if you think about, there are two measures I just want to offer about polling that ask us to think about what our duties are as scholars of patterns and interpreters of the world in which we live, as social scientists and as humanists, is that among the many distorting effects of polling is when George Gallup was doing his polling, the percentage of people who answered a poll, the number of people who answered a poll, or percentage of those who were asked, was well above 90%. Today it's 3%. So most people who are asked to participate in a public opinion poll refuse. So the accuracy of polls is much worse than it has ever been, which is why there are all these polling aggregators like Nate Silver's 538, which are trying to just essentially correct for the inevitable distortions of polls because people refuse to participate in them. Polls have been wrong all over the world for the last 3 years, repeatedly. And yet polls are relied upon and have affected the American political process more than ever before. It's easy to forget this is the first year, if you can recall way back to May of 2015, the first GOP primary debate. Fox News decided to use polls to decide who would be on the main stage and who would stand where, behind which podium. It was 461 days ago that they did that. Most reputable polling organizations refused to participate. Pew and Gallup, for instance, refused to participate. The Wall Street Journal, NBC News refused to participate on the grounds that there was a completely inappropriate and politically mischievous use of polling so far in advance of an election to make such an incredible determination as the power that is placed by the man who takes center stage on during a primary debate. And that man, of course, was Donald Trump, the candidate who was known to people who were polled better than any other candidate. I'm going to leave it there. I just wanted to sort of introduce some themes about journalism and the relationship between journalism and history and punditry, and to insist that we understand polling as a form of journalism.
Thank you very much, Jill. In fact, in doing that, you've also raised important issues about time and the timing question. You know, the foreshortening of time, the creation of a past and a present, time as analogy. And I think you've raised some very deep questions about the writing of journalism, but also the way in which it affects our whole sense of democratic politics in our time. So these temporal questions, I think, are very deep. Thank you, David.
I want to first thank Homi Bhabha and his colleagues for putting together this event and giving us an opportunity to join together tonight in trying to analyze what has just happened. I'm a behavioral economist, and I try to introduce both economic and psychological analysis into the study of human choices. And I'm going to try to do that in the next 10 minutes and explicate the choices, the decisions that the electorate made yesterday. I want to begin with a question to you so you can see and just think about your own intuitions. As people were approached in exit polls as they left polling stations yesterday, they were asked, what is the most important issue of the election? The leading contenders were foreign policy, immigration, the economy, and terrorism. And I want you to just roughly guesstimate what the percentages are. They were asked to choose one and only one of these categories, how the percentages broke out across these four categories. Just engage in that introspection for a second. So here's the data. As you can see, categories that we talk a lot about, immigration, terrorism, ended up, at least in these exit polls, not rising to the top of the list. Now, I want you to think about these exit polls and the people who were responding yesterday. Those who said that the condition of the economy was excellent, only 16% of them voted for Trump. Those who said that the condition of the economy was good, only 19% voted for Trump. Those who said it was fair, 55% voted for Trump. And those who said it was poor, 79% voted for Trump. We see an extraordinary gradient of Trump support aligning with the public's view of the economy. And we're going to come back to this again in a few more, in multiple exhibits as I go through the data. So I think at this point, there's been enough demographic analysis that's been shared in every context to know who are Trump supporters. They tend to be white without a college degree, and that's especially true when we compare the support to support for Republican candidates in previous presidential elections. So these numbers are high, but they're particularly high when we look historically. So if we look at the individuals, again, in these exit polls, who are non-white without a college degree, 20% said they voted for Trump. Non-white with a college degree, 23% voted for Trump. Trump's support lives in the third category. White without a college degree, 67% said they voted for Trump. And then white college graduates, 49% said they voted for Trump. So this is the demographic that we want to think about. White without a college degree, but especially I want to focus on the experience of Americans over the last 50 years if you didn't have a college degree. Now I'm talking about a group that is underrepresented in this room, underrepresented in Cambridge, underrepresented in, I think, many of our lives. Let's look at their experiences and their real wages. So we're going to adjust for inflation here. This is data from David Otter, once a doctoral student here, now star faculty at MIT. We're going to look at men on the left and women on the right. We're going to track their progress economically from 1964, where we've normalized the data to 1, David's normalized the data to 1, up to 2012, when this analysis ended. And you see here 5 different groups. The top blue line, I'll go on the left first, though the educational categories are symmetric across the two. The top blue line are people who have more than a bachelor's degree. The orange line are people with only a bachelor's degree. The green line, labeled on the right, are people with some college. The red line, labeled on the right, are people with a high school degree, and the blue line are people who don't have a high school degree. And we're tracking here, in some sense, typical earnings for people with a full-time job in these categories, starting in 1963 and going through 2012. And you see a very depressing and troubling picture of differential progress for these groups. You see that the groups that have more than a bachelor's degree have on average doubled their income during this period. And again, these are people with a job. So we'll come to people who are out of the labor force in a moment. You see that people with a bachelor's degree have had a 40% increase in their inflation-adjusted earnings. You see that people with only some college on the left, men, have a 20% increase. You see that people with a high school degree have a 10% increase over this 50-year period. And you see that people without a high school degree have actually had a decline in their real standard of living over this 50-year period. Now, when we flip to the right panel for women, it's a slightly more optimistic picture at the bottom of the graph for people with lower levels of education, but you see a very similar pattern. The gains have been disproportionately experienced by those elites with the most education. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, this is on top people with full-time jobs. Of course, one of the most psychologically traumatic experiences in our economy is not to have a job. And in fact, withdrawal from the labor force has been disproportionately experienced by people in these lower educational attainment categories. So not only have their incomes not risen, but they have tended to find themselves out of the workforce, unemployed. So for a lot of people in our country, what we think of broadly as the American dream, and that obviously has many different definitions, I won't try to litigate that right now, that American dream is slipping away. Slowing aggregate economic growth and rising economic inequality have jointly implied that a falling fraction of kids are going to do better than their parents when those kids grow up. If you look at the immediate aftermath of World War II, scholars are finding that almost all kids in those cohorts ended up having economically richer lives, adjusting for inflation, than their parents. Almost everyone was on that upward trajectory. If you look today, a majority of kids are not going to have that experience. Their economic prospects, as we look at the generations that we can observe and the generations to come, look diminished relative to their parents. Now, you might wonder, how is that possible? It's possible because the gains from our economic progress are going to a very small set of elites, well represented on this campus, and not going to the vast majority of our population. Families on a downward economic trajectory overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump. Let's take a look at that data. When you ask people, again, in these exit polls, about their own family's financial situation, if they said they were better today, 24% voted for Trump. If they said they were about the same, 46% voted for Trump. And if they said they were worse off today, 78% voted for Trump. And that's looking back. We can also ask them about their views looking forward. What do you expect for the next generation of Americans? A better life than the life today, only 38% vote for Trump. About the same, 39% vote for Trump. Worse than today, which again is reality for approximately half of our population, 63% vote for Trump. An image that is very powerful, it sears many, it enchants many others. This is the core message of the Trump campaign. Make America great again. I want you to think very hard about that message, a message I've thought a lot about in the last 24 hours. There's two reactions I think we all have, or you might have. One reaction is, America is great already, and Trump supporters are wrong. But there's another reaction, which is also legitimate. Trump supporters have a point. For working class families, of course, white and black working class families, the American dream has partially collapsed. The progress that we all took for granted at the start of the post-war period and that lasted for decades has stalled for the majority of American families. Not for the elites who have the benefit of an education, of a college education or better, but for the typical American family. And of course, as you all know, Trump supporters are not alone. This is a worldwide phenomenon. This goes beyond America. Populist parties are gaining strength around the world. Trump's success is just one instance of growing worldwide opposition to a kind of post-war consensus that is collapsing everywhere. What is that? What was that consensus? Open borders and immigration, globalization and free trade, tolerance and pluralism, democracy and the rule of law, and the status of educational elites and the establishment. People trusted us to help make good decisions for society, trusted us to give the right policy advice, trusted us to take everyone forward. And as I've shown you, it hasn't worked for everyone. It's worked for us. And what I unfortunately foresee is a much darker road ahead. As bad as you may feel right now, or as enchanted as you may feel right now, the forces that I've described are going to intensify. There is no optimistic scenario that tells us that this rising inequality is going to quickly reverse. Technology is going to make it a lot worse, and probably very quickly. What's going to happen in 2030 when millions of commercial drivers lose their jobs to self-driving vehicles? It will happen before then, but it will certainly happen by 2030. Will new jobs replace the old ones that have gone? That's always been the way it worked out historically. But more and more economists see a future that's not going to play out the way it worked historically. We're worried that people will increasingly find themselves unable to compete with polite, smart, adaptable, quiet, self-educating, efficient, docile machines. And more people are going to find themselves out of work, maybe supported by the government, and disenchanted with a system that does not validate them and their ability to contribute. We should all be very scared about this trend towards rising inequality, and we should be asking ourselves, to what degree and how quickly will robots and artificial intelligence accelerate the trends in inequality that have already torn our country apart and are going to do much more mischief to come? So let me pause as a social scientist, let me conclude rather as a social scientist and describe, explicate this election, which by now I guess is not a mystery. How do you win an election now and perhaps in the future, probably in the future too? Identify a very large demographic group whose economic fortunes have stagnated for 2 generations and who feel abandoned and disdained. In this election, that happens to be the white working class. But more generally, it's that majority of the world, of the developed world, that is not obtaining the benefits of economic growth, where those benefits are increasingly enjoyed by a minority of the population. And then, having identified that group, voice their issues. What were Donald Trump's issues? How did he appeal to the white working class? Immigration and the threat to jobs through immigration, the threat to domestic jobs, trade and the implied threat to employment, manufacturing jobs that have declined over the past century, the American dream, which, as I've just shown you, has diminished for a majority of our country, elites, and the policy pronouncements that we've been making that have done very well for us and have, in practice, despite our best intentions, not done well for a majority of the country. Nationalism, crime, affordable health care, taxes, the rigged system, presumably rigged for our benefit because we were the ones making the rules, and America's diminished stature in an increasingly complicated world where there are other economic and military powerhouses that actually tell us that we can't dictate as we did 50 years ago. Let me offer an important quote from Donald Trump's acceptance speech. "Working together, we will begin the urgent task of rebuilding our nation and renewing the American dream." And now I just skip a few sentences. He continues, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer." Who are those forgotten men and women of our country? The white working class. Sadly, and here I look upon our own community as failing, we had decades of hoarding, rising inequality, and economic stagnation for workers without a college degree. It was apparent. We've seen this. It's not a surprise. The data I showed you, is not completely novel. But we failed to address the needs of these groups that were being left behind. And now, they've returned the favor with a candidate who's promised them that he's going to take care of them. Unfortunately, I fear, as an economist, that they've chosen a false prophet. But time will tell. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad to be here, and thanks to Jill and David for the insightful comments. I'm somebody who, in addition to teaching here, as some of you know, writes for the Washington Post, and so I've been a pretty early, consistent, aggressive critic of Trump throughout the course of this campaign, largely actually for reasons like those articulated by David. That is to say, I saw those issues and those constituencies, the magnitude of the problems facing us, but thought that he was not the right person to help us get to the next place. This is not to say that I exactly thought that Hillary Clinton was the right person either, but I thought that we stood a better chance of a bridge to the place of being able to address the magnitude of the problems David presented with her leadership. At any rate, for my brief remarks, I'm going to go ahead and read a piece that I wrote for the Post today called Waking Up. At least that's what I called it. They always put different titles on these things, but I called it Waking Up. The meaning of this election will depend not on the president-elect, but on what every one of us does today, and tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after. The true contest begins only now. Over the past 15 months, the matters at stake have been written out about extensively on any number of pages, newspaper pages. Can we preserve a people united by a shared commitment to a democratic republic, if by nothing else? Can we secure the constitutional rights that make our commitment to a democratic republic real? Can we put racial domination behind us, abandon the denigration of women, sexual minorities, immigrants, the disabled, and the religiously faithful, and also free our economy from the inequality traps set for us by globalization? With high hope for the future, to paraphrase Lincoln, as some of you who know me in these audiences know I do a lot, I nonetheless venture no prediction. The prayers of one side to put 11 million undocumented citizens on the path to citizenship, and of the other side to deport them all, cannot both be answered. The hopes of one side for an end to discrimination against transgender people, and of the other side to be free of even having to think about transgender experiences, cannot both be satisfied. Nor is it likely that, in the end, the prayers and hopes of either side will be answered fully. To believe in democracy is to accept the disappointment of the imperfect outcome. What good, then, is democracy? By virtue of participating in these contests, we are free. Only by participating in these contests can we be free. We are disappointed today, but can try again for tomorrow. To be a democratic citizen requires endurance, resilience, and tenacity. The project of self-government endures just as long as we are willing to accept our losses in electoral contests. If we cease to accept our losses, democracy is at an end. It must break up into ever smaller units until it is no more. What makes us a united people is nothing more and nothing less than our willingness to accept political defeats. That's it, the strange alchemy that makes democracy. But there's a vital second part to this question. What makes it possible to accept loss in the political arena? Only unshakable confidence that impartial judicial institutions will secure our constitutional rights. These rights limit the depth of the defeat we can suffer. To preserve ourselves as a people willing to concede elections, we need confidence in our mutual commitments to one another's constitutional rights. And if we are to have this confidence, we need judicial institutions that act with disinterestedness and impartiality. Compared with the antics of the FBI, the findings against Rolling Stone for defamation and against New Jersey Governor Chris Christie's Bridgegate deputies brought sweet relief. Somewhere out there, outside of Washington, the justice system still operates in plain and sensible ways, securing liberty and dispensing justice to all. The election has made clear that we have work to do to restore the value of disinterestedness, nod to Howard, in the nation's capital and everywhere. If we lose impartiality, we lose our democracy. So see, I am one of those apocalyptic people that Jill was talking about. Finally, as we speed toward being a society in which no ethnic group is in the majority, there is the question of whether we can refashion our social and economic relations, to David's point, to support liberty and justice for all. In this election, rural Americans and Americans without college degrees sought release from the trap of diminished opportunities. Sadly, their fine aspirations have gotten wretchedly mixed up with the desires of the David Dukes among us, and their amplifiers, including the president-elect. The David Dukes of our country find their solutions to our problems in the pursuit of racial purity and restored domination. In this election, they have gained far too much influence. Each and every one of us can help unmix that mess by bringing our creativity to the question of how to reorganize educational and economic opportunities so they are spread fairly throughout the population. Again, to David's incredibly important point. Add to the list the task of engaging anew in a fight for hearts and minds, a quest to inspire a commitment to equality. Finally, let us begin, each and every one of us, to learn again how to listen. We are hearing important things from both sides in this contest that in each case the other side doesn't yet know how to hear. Surely we all seek a just and lasting peace among ourselves. If so, three things are necessary: securing our peoplehood, securing our rights, and securing social equality and economic fairness, both things together. In a time where we seem to have no common projects, we should shift our collective focus to the one thing we do share, our constitutional union. We need to focus on restoring the health and functionality of our political institutions. With charity toward all and malice toward none, forgive me, I'm doing it again, I, for one, concede today. With charity toward all and malice toward none, with firmness in the right as my own God helps me to work to discern the right, I, and others too, I'm sure, commit to using pen and voice, argument and exhortation, tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, at every phase of the great contest that faces us now. It is a worthy cause, an effort to rebuild our democratic republic and to forge a connected society with liberty and justice for all. What will become of us depends on each of us.
Thank you, Dan. I want to thank all three of you for bringing different but interlocking issues on the table. The bedrock of education seems to be absolutely central, and that is something that relates to constitution, our understanding of constitutional rights, to listening, to voice, and I think here in the university this is something we can take extraordinarily seriously, the democratization of education, because I think it was Du Bois's great point that you cannot have democracy if you have inequality in educational opportunity. You can't do it. And I agree very much with Du Bois. Disappointed today and trying tomorrow. I think that's extraordinarily important. But Danielle, you talked about securing that hope, if you like, in constitutional rights, amongst other things. David, you talked about economic wrongs, right? The constitutional rights on the one hand and economic wrongs, and your prediction is very dire, very, very dire on this issue. How do we work across these things? How can you give that hope if, as you say, robots are going to replace people, or self-drive cars are going to put several thousand drivers out of it? Where do we get that moral or that ethical sense that we can actually communicate this? And finally, I just want to tie something that worked across the panel. You talked about the apocalyptic moment, Jill, with your interest in time and history, the apocalyptic moment. You mentioned the false prophet, right? The question of the false prophet. So there's a different language here emerging in this panel, a different layer of narrative. And so I want to ask you, was it the prophetic personality of Trump in some way? Because the policy, everybody said, and as you indeed say, you think he's the false prophet, but he was not able to communicate. Most people said he was never able to actually give you an economic argument or even a political political guideline of any value. It was this huge bluster, this rhetorical power, this apocalyptic vision. So what made this demographic constituency follow him? Was it, again, a certain kind of rhetorical personality? Because on policy, it was hugely weak. And if it is that kind of thing, if it is a kind of toxic combination of a certain kind of person, a certain kind of, and a certain kind of media, then I think we have to take that whole issue of the presentation, the performance of politics very seriously. And finally, we did not mention that many of our problems, and not from 1964 onwards, but certainly from 2000, have been because this is a country which is at war. So there's something about a war economy which also creates, of course, the question of migration, displacement, the war on drugs, Syria, so it seemed to me that war was another issue that we have to actually connect in some way with the landscape of this election. So just a few thoughts, very quick thoughts on your very thoughtful presentation. So any ideas you might have?
I can jump in and start us off there. I was thinking today, I spent my day writing something quite different from what Danielle has written, her beautiful essay. I was thinking about Frederick Douglass all day, so I had to think about Frederick Douglass today. And Frederick Douglass gave this speech in 1862 called The Reasons for Our Troubles, when the Civil War had just begun. And people were looking around and asking, well, what is the explanation for our deplorable state, is the question that Douglass said everyone was asking. And people's general answers amounted to three. The problem for the division of the Union was either the election of Abraham Lincoln, or it was the perfidy and villainy of Southern politicians, or it was the excesses and moral purity and absolutism of abolitionists. And Douglass said, these explanations stink. The explanation, why the cause of our deplorable state is the institution of slavery. And what we have failed to see is that when you shackle a man to his ankle, at the other end you have shackled your own neck. And that there can be no uncoupling until you see that you are bound together in that system. And I was thinking about Douglass when I was listening, David, to your remarks, because it's essentially the same argument. We might think this was the cause of our deplorable state is the election of Donald Trump, or the division of our union is the outcome of the election of Donald Trump, and that is attributable to ideas about immigration or ideas about terrorism. But no, would say Douglass, or would say David, the answer is inequality. And what Douglass learned in the wake of the Civil War was that the inequality that is slavery will take another form, and that there will always be another form in which inequality is manifest. And for him, his next big battles were the right of women to vote, and he was opposed to the Chinese Exclusion Act and the restrictions placed on Chinese immigrants. But what I think David's remarks reveal is the way in which we don't talk obviously about slavery, but inequality, if you will recall, until about 2011 was no part of the mainstream American political lexicon. It really was only Bernie Sanders. If you go back and look at the congressional record, Bernie Sanders is the only guy in the Senate who talked about income inequality before about 2011. And then suddenly it became a GOP issue. And you couldn't stop people from talking. You couldn't stop people like Ted Cruz from talking about economic inequality because they wanted to blame it on Obama. So there was a whole turn in the sort of partisan implementation of an argument about inequality that sets up what I think is an explanation that is both true and people know in their gut. You don't have to listen to someone explain inequality to know that you haven't got far and that your kids are not doing too well. But that there's nevertheless a whole set of other explanations that are thrown up because it's so hard to think about inequality. And for just the reasons that David was talking about, it's going to take another form no matter how hard you fight it.
Thank you very much. That's one response. Yes.
So in kind of bouncing off of your comments, and by the way, I very much agree with what you just said in terms of finding other explanations when, in fact, the real explanation lies beneath it all, the rising inequality. But coming back to, Homi, your comments, I do think there are things that we can do to address inequality and to address the rising technological changes. I'll describe some, but I want to admit we're late. I particularly found your point at the very beginning of our evening. You said almost too late. I hope we're almost too late and not, in fact,
Too late.
Too late. So we have extraordinary differences of educational opportunity in this country. When you look at the differences between the schools that some kids get to go to and the schools that other kids get to go to, and you ask, why are we surprised that 30 years later those kids have radically different outcomes? Well, we should be investing very heavily in improving these educational opportunities. And of course, this idea goes back over 100 years, equality of educational opportunity. Well, we don't live up to that. And to the extent that we need to address a world in which skilled labor, highly skilled labor will be needed and less skilled labor will not be needed, we need to think very hard about how to create those educational opportunities. Actually, I'll acknowledge I was disappointed by the vote on charter schools yesterday. There is an extraordinary amount of research done by scholars here in Cambridge and around the country showing that while charter schools are poor solutions in many places, for example, New Orleans, they have not been a success. The charter schools in Boston have been an extraordinary pathway to success. And so I was disappointed that our Commonwealth didn't take that step and say, this is an opportunity to improve educational opportunities for many of our most disadvantaged young children. There's other ways we can bring people into the workforce. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a powerful tool for creating opportunities for employers to hire people, even people with low skills. And that's another domain in which we should be working, I think, very actively. Now, you asked about the false prophet, and suddenly it occurred to me he's a false prophet in two ways, depending upon how you spell the word prophet, and how he succeeded rhetorically. And of course, this is one of those examples where there are so many ways that he succeeded that there's no monocause here. It's the personality that appealed to many of the people that voted for him. It's his extraordinary capacity to perform. You're quite right. It's his connection to issues that did animate many of his supporters, issues that I listed on that slide, like immigration, like trade, like the loss of manufacturing jobs. You don't need to necessarily say, I have the solution and here it is, a 15-point plan, to point to the issues that animate your supporters and say, well, trust me, I'll come up with that plan later, which is what he has essentially said. He connected to them through these issues, and they forgave him the absence of an actual plan. And of course, he was able to exploit a lot of Hillary Clinton's vulnerabilities. We can, review all the ways in which servers, which may or may not have been important. In my view, that issue was gravely overblown, but it was an issue that he was able to get incredible traction on. And I think Jill pointed out there is an appetite for change, especially after one party has been in power for 8 years, but particularly right now in a world where so many American households feel left behind economically. So I think all of those forces jointly gave him a powerful opening, one that kind of took us by surprise when we look back 18 months. Had we asked ourselves back then, would we be sitting here tonight with this outcome? Of course not.
I said yes.
You saw it coming. Okay, so all credit to Danielle.
Sorry, anyway.
But no credit to me.
Danielle.
So I'm going to push back at my esteemed colleagues a little bit with regard to their description of the fundamental problem. So I think the fundamental problem is bigger than simply income inequality. That is one strand of the problem, but in fact we face a convergence of multiple issues. I'm just going to focus on two because they intersect. So I'm going to leave aside the big issues like climate change and so forth, which are sort of looming out there, which are not about the Constitution of American domestic politics. But with regard to the Constitution of American domestic politics, it is equally important, the point I alluded to in my piece, that we are, halfway. We're really close to being a society in which no ethnic group is in the majority. In 2020, college-age population will be majority-minority. I mean, it's that question is done. It's decided. We're making that transition. It was initiated in 1965 with Johnson's Immigration Act. It doesn't matter really whether you want to think about legal or illegal immigration. It would have happened with legal immigration. The only way that would not happen at this point would be if cultural patterns changed dramatically in terms of who's having kids. That's the only way where we wouldn't make this transition. And it simply is the case that in the socioeconomic structure of American life, the distributive patterns have always been linked to race. So if the underlying demographic pattern changes fundamentally, that's actually another crank on the question of how the economy is being reorganized. So we have both the problem of income inequality and the acceleration advancing on us because of technology, and a thorough reworking of the underlying social fabric of America. And that's what Trump said to his supporters, and that's what they heard, and that's what they agreed with. And they're right. And they shifted the public agenda, rightly, to the deepest issues facing the country, which is why the list of policy issues that everybody's agitated about sort of feels irrelevant, because those policy issues miss the core underlying agenda. So there's been a failure on the other side to articulate a competitive vision responding to those twin phenomena. That's why there's work to do today and tomorrow and the day after. And I invite all of you to direct your energies to those twinned questions.
What about the fact that the class issue in the United States is not really taken on head-on very often? It's not. So it, in fact, seeps into questions of race, inequality. It moves in various directions. We had an event the other day, with the Dorothy Roberts lectures, and this again was an issue that class is evaded, and so it overdetermines other parts of the discussion. And I wonder whether race class coming together isn't actually a very, very potent issue here in relation to what you've just said.
Well, you've put your finger on, the heart of the difficulty in a certain sense, that race in the history of the country, look at sort of late 19th century and the way sort of agrarian politics worked and so forth, race had permitted us in this country to obscure issues of class. That is to say, the working class could be split along race lines, et cetera. Jill knows this history far better than I do. I feel embarrassed even to be, referring to it in front of her. Anyway, to some extent, those issues don't function the way they did, right? There's not a sort of automatic tracking of race and class in a way that there was at a certain point historically. The coming apart is obviously sort of partial and incomplete, but there are losses, particularly for the white working class in that coming apart. There are losses of standing. That's just a fact. And it's hard. It's really hard. And it produces resentment. And that's why, in general, it's so important to try to figure out how to rethink broadly the concepts of fairness and equality and opportunity so they include everybody. So for example, with regard to formulations about sort of social justice projects, it's very easy when one's focusing on the experience of African Americans, for instance, and I'm guilty of this myself, to cast the blame, in effect, on white Americans. And that obscures the kind of growth of inequality and experience for the working class white Americans that both David and Jill have been talking about. And so, and that's basically not fair, right? And so there's got to be a way of opening up the question about justice and fairness that can bring together the concerns of people who are getting different ends of two different short sticks, basically. Yep. Oh, which reminds me, I meant to say, it's not all doom and gloom, all right? Major victory today. Marijuana in Massachusetts and California. And I don't just mean that, okay? I don't just mean that because it gives everybody a way to escape from current events, okay? I mean that because that is an attack on the war on drugs. Trump is in favor of the war on drugs. Those are votes that Trump lost. And there are cracks in the edifice of the war on drugs, and we have to keep pushing on those. And so that's, so it's not just about Trump victory. There was a victory on the other side today.
Thanks. I'm sure this plea for the joint will join us up in a sense of solidarity. I want to also add the question of dignity and, fairness and justice, but also the perceived sense of dignity that goes with the issues we've been talking about today. And I want to open up. We have half an hour for questions. I'm sure we're going to have many questions. Please keep your questions brief. Statement with a question mark at the end of it, and not a large peroration of one kind or another. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful expose. And the question is, if we're talking about inequality and the messaging being on the Republican side, thank you, that this was effective, how come it would seem that the messaging on the Democratic side failed when there were similar platform policies? I guess the question is, what gives? Why didn't a platform that provides free education and healthcare and equal opportunity fail to convince these people? That's the question. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you.
So I would note that the Sanders campaign very much engaged these issues as well. So there's a kind of parallel engagement in the primary. But you're right that it didn't pass over to the general election. And I think Clinton did not recognize the power of this issue, and to her credit, wasn't willing to pander. Well, it gets complicated. So being able to get up and say, hey, we've got to beat up Mexico and China, that was something that Donald Trump was very willing to do, and something that Hillary Clinton, to her credit, was not willing to do. Being able to beat up on Mexican immigrants was something that Donald Trump was very willing to do, and Hillary Clinton, to her credit, was not willing to do. So I think surely her advisors understand everything that's on those slides, but there's a willingness.
Actually, I don't think they do.
Well, okay.
Sorry, but I don't.
They may not. Okay, so I am not connected to her campaign, so that was a speculation on my part. They should, and maybe.
I agree with that.
But she wasn't willing to exploit some of the narratives that are relevant on this issue, and I think that cost her.
But the white working, just to clarify though, I mean, there's a way to do this without having to bash Mexico and China that could still win over these people. All you have to say is, we understand your pain. These programs will benefit everyone. So what fails in that messaging? Is there something beyond this to say, well, we don't want to help everyone. We want to help first, and we feel that your programs don't actually benefit us. I mean, this is not me talking. This is the perception, right, versus reality.
Can I jump in on that one for a second? Or Jill, did you want to? Sorry. So I was just going to say quickly, I think that's where Clinton just had, this is to the vulnerabilities of Clinton, had a really sort of impossible time of overcoming the perception of her own sort of feathering of her own nest, right? Trump obviously is feathering his own nest, so it's completely unfair, but I think that rhetorical distinction was the perception that she was feathering it from the public trough, in effect. That is, through her connection to public power. And that's what made her untrustworthy with regard to whether she would actually truly divert kind of public resources to solving these problems. Trump doesn't need public resources. It makes it trustworthy that he would actually divert public resources to solving these problems.
Do you want to respond?
No, I'll wait so we can get more questions in.
Okay. Please.
I guess I wanted, first of all, thank you. All of you have helped at least some of this be reframed for me, but I want to push back on all of you to some degree, because what was shocking to me, I was at Wellesley College, I'm an alum, watching the election, was the disgusting misogyny that you haven't touched on. You have not touched that.
I mentioned it.
But not.
That's true.
I
Didn't
mean,
address it, but
I'm just saying the debates, her level of, as President Obama said, nobody has been more prepared. Even, Trump University, who he's ripped off, is all these contractors. Can you imagine the Clintons doing that once? I'm just saying we women have lived through these double standards. And we live it every day with this soccer team on this campus. And I, for one, am fucking sick of it. I'm sick of it.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you so much. It's very useful, and we will respond to it. I'm going to take a few questions, and then the panel can respond. Yes, I'll take 3 questions.
Hillary Clinton was in favor of the war in Iraq. She was in favor of the sanctions on Iraq, which probably killed more than the war. She was in favor of the war in Libya, the wars in Gaza, the war in Serbia, in Honduras, in Ukraine, many other places. So why is it a sad day when we defeat a war criminal and mass murderer like Clinton and get rid of the Bushes and the Clintons and their endless wars forever?
Thank you for your important thought.
Actually, it seems that people elected Trump partly because they thought we needed a strong leader to act against ISIS and so on. So I guess they still don't consider a woman strong enough as a leader. She just doesn't look right. But my question had to do with that statistic, which David, or among the very interesting statistics, was one that jumped out at me. 49% of college graduates voted for Trump. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's a shift from the pre-polling, isn't it?
That means that we have to, I imagine that doesn't
vote.
include Harvard graduates.
Yes.
Yeah, but let us ask ourselves the question, why is it that 49% of college graduates, who are not in the category of those poor, downtrodden, working class, farm miners, but they're not in that category. So why did they vote for Trump? I think that it has to do with what has been said, with what Danielle was saying too. There is a really ugly strain here, and that is coming to the fore, which is extremely bothersome and terrifying in this country, that the way to try to assert ourselves is by creating others. And the others are all the people, immigrants, Mexicans, Jews, for that matter. This is the part that I think we have to ask ourselves. And wait, Homi, just one sec.
Susan, you've answered your question. You've asked your question, you've answered it.
No, but I would like to ask the question here. What are we doing as college professors, as university professors, to encourage people to use their mind rather than just to follow the crowd or whatever.
Thank you. What are we, well, let's take this question now, Susan's question. What are we doing here to get our students to use their minds rather than follow stereotypes or issues that are, or positions that are given to them with a certain rhetorical force, but very little conceptual or political justification? I mean, it's a quick response. We have a real long line up there, but I do want to have a quick response to that.
Well, I will just say I've thought a lot about that, about the different orthodoxies in different communities. And I mentioned I'm teaching this new U.S. history class in the spring. And the way I'm teaching is that each week is a formal debate where the students have assigned positions to defend arguments that they themselves do not believe, using evidence that was available to people who did hold those beliefs. And to go back to, the origins of a liberal arts education, which insisted on formal debate as the best means of learning the art of disputation in order to be a disinterested citizen. And it's just an experiment that I'm doing, but I find in the classroom that it's quite difficult to get students to disagree with one another. And yet we live in a world in which our politicians are very willing to disagree with one another without foundation and in an ad hominem way, that we now have a world where disagreement looks like nastiness and agreement looks like civility, and that's crazy. And that's quite destructive of democratic conversation.
This notion of that we have to have a consensual society rather than a dissensual one, I think is, to be successful, I think it's an extremely important issue.
So in my community, in the economics department, our focus is on evidence-based argument. So the transformation in economics was from a field that was entirely or mostly purely theory 30 years ago to a field today where we combine data and theory. And so now an economic argument must include, and this is what we're teaching our students, the empirical evidence that actually supports the claim. One can no longer get up and say, I have an idea, here's my conclusion, done. Well, you've got to back it up with data. And that's the message that I want our students, and I hope students everywhere, to learn so that they don't get confused by false prophets who offer data-free conclusions.
But does empirical data then also create this ethic and habit of productive disagreement? That's the issue. Is that the way they're taught? I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
To be able to actually debate and disagree, and to see disagreement as a very positive thing, to see doubt as a positive thing.
So we tend to think about everything probabilistically right from the start. So there's always uncertainty in our world about who's right, who's wrong, what the parameter is, what the right policy is, and one simply builds up more evidence, and one never reaches confidence or complete confidence. And I would urge all of you to come and attend an economic seminar where there is a surfeit of disagreement.
Danielle, I know that you're very involved in pedagogy of this kind, in collaborative pedagogy too. Could you say something about that?
So are we all. It's a huge and important question. I think it's a parallel question to the one that Jill asked about journalism, actually. And it's really, how do we restore a set of healthy intellectual habits, analytical habits, argumentative habits across the board? I think the issue is slightly different, to be honest, and I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer right now. You pointed to the single data point in David's presentation that was surprising to me, which was the percentage of white college graduates who voted for Trump. That moved by yesterday from the polling numbers, which means that's the group of people who specifically, presumably, were obscuring their views when they were polled. All right, so what's that about? We need to understand that. Is it a story about political correctness and people sort of not getting their views out? There's an argument to make, those are the independent people, right? As against what the rest of us on college campuses are doing. So it's not an easy question to figure out how to make sure that we have a context where people can disagree, aren't afraid to disagree on campus, but have the competencies and resources to do it. I think formal debate is a really good idea, taking the burden off of identity by assigning positions to people against their own views. So I think that's a kind of line forward, separating identity from the skills that go with being able to debate points.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I'm going to take the gentleman who's been waiting here. If you please line up behind the mics, then I can see who wants to ask a question.
Okay.
And then I'm going to take, after you, I'm going to take those three people, and then we'll respond again. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
Larry Friedman. I'm friendly to all of you. I've worked with Dave Axelrod since 2007. And were Dave here, he would bring up a couple of things. One, going back in terms of this inequality, poor white working class and so forth, Vonnegut's player piano, obviously Jack Weller's Yesterday's People. There's a literature going way, way before this election. The other thing, though, is that the name of the game yesterday, at least as Axelrod taught me, was to get 270 electoral votes. However the hell you can get them, and we didn't. And in other words, it's the old cliche, politics is local. It's not quite local anymore. But it's relevant that, say, just up the street in New Hampshire, Maggie won. But we lost the governorship to a guy named Sununu. Now, it's these kinds of problems, the so-called mini problems, that I think we should be dealing with if we want to get 270 electoral votes next
Here,
time.
here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
There are doomsday cults that predict the end of the world, and when the date arrives and the world doesn't end, the cults often continue to exist. So if Trump fails to deliver and rebuild America and bring coal back and do all these things he's promised it, what I would like to hear from you is what you think will happen to his base.
The false prophet argument, yes.
Yes.
Can we take another couple of questions, please? False prophet.
So Danielle, you talked about the politics of protest and the need for all of us to activate, and something that I'm really struggling with to build the imagination for that is what levers we can actually pull with protest, given that we lost both houses of the Congress. Almost all of our state legislatures are either divided or Republican controlled, and the outcomes in 2018 for the midterms look pretty bleak, and then in 2020, maybe something big over the next 4 years can change, but things don't look great, and whoever controls state legislatures again redraws district lines, and the cycle repeats. So if we do organize through our different, talents and abilities, what levers in the next 2 years at a minimum, but the next 4 years more likely, do we actually get to pull?
Very important question. Thank you very much.
Professor Liebman addressed the fear that the machines are coming for our jobs, and it's funny that or interesting that idea starts sort of contrasting it to the end of the Second World War, where we'd just come out of what the war economy sort of driven growth, and now we don't need people to do jobs. And it looks like we don't need people to wage wars either. So I was just wondering what your views are on the threat of the machines coming to kill us, and the fact that we don't need people to be able to mobilize the full coercive apparatus of the state anymore.
Thank you very much. Is there a final question there?
It's maybe similar. This is also a question for Professor Laibson. What would an economist say are potential solutions? I know you mentioned the earned income tax credit, but it seems to me that there's both a problem of inequality and maybe just a shrinking number of jobs. And my impression is that a lot of people don't want to be paid for not working, that they want to have a job. So is there some way of creating more jobs with fewer tasks to do, or, yeah?
Let's start with the first two questions. That if this is a kind of false prophet, if Trump is a false prophet, then there's really going to be mayhem at some point. And how could we best organize protest in that context? I just want to put those two questions, the false prophet and the protest question together. What would be the most useful forms of activism? So let's start with you, David, and then we can go around the room.
Some water.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, we were starting with me, did you say?
No,
I'm
David.
starting, but I'm
Okay.
seeing that you need a little drink.
Thank you, appreciate it.
We all need a drink. So
Yeah, not a little one.
I do think there's an overwhelming case that he's not going to deliver to the people that elected him. When you look at the policies that he's laid out, they're more likely actually to help the elites that he's ranting against than to help the white working class. So I think there'll be a lot of disappointment there, but I think the fundamental force of inequality driving populist economic policies is going to persist. And the question is, where does it take hold? Who gives voice to those concerns? Who offers real solutions, productive solutions? And at the moment, the Republican Party has pivoted to address that community. One could easily imagine the Democratic Party offering, as I think someone in the third row or fourth row suggested, perhaps alternative solutions, real solutions. So I think that we're in an epicycle that is going to look radically different than the post-war consensus. And the new policy challenge, which almost every question touched upon, is what are we going to do in a world where the benefits of technology and economic growth accrue to a smaller and smaller fraction of the population, and how are we going to bring a life that's meaningful, that's economically, that is abundant in terms of resources and abundant in terms of meaning, in terms of purposefulness, to the entire population. And that is the great question of our age. That is a question that we should all be working on. And I got to confess, I'm a little terrified that we're not going to solve it in time. Now, I'm not predicting protests in the next 4 years, but I do see a kind of end of the post-war consensus that may bring us to a new set of policies that are productive in addressing these issues, or may bring us to a chaotic end and something that feels much more like a civil war than a change in our policy proposals.
Jill, since you talked about the apocalyptic vision, why don't you take this on too?
Yeah, I guess I do have a fairly gloomy vision about that, because although these are economic problems that require economic solutions, those solutions have to come in the form of political arrangements. And the tools with which to make those political arrangements seem to be diminishing, as your question suggests, the question about organizing and protest and what are the steps to take. I mean, one of the great missed stories of this election cycle is endless coverage of the dismantling and unraveling of the Republican Party, and very little attention to the dismantling of the Democratic Party, which made a terrible decision early on, in my view, to put its support behind Hillary Clinton as its inevitable nominee. I think that was a very bad decision on the part of the DNC. And I think that the Democratic Party obviously we know the Democratic Party just institutionally is far weak. It is completely weak relative to the Republican Party. And it is devoid of ideas. That's the problem with the Democratic problem. It's not only that there's a generation of young candidates that have not been groomed, that did not come upon the coattails of Obama, and instead turned to Clinton and Clinton-era appointees and Clinton-era advisors, and it was a very backward-looking and not a forward-looking position for the party's leadership to take. That they're really the great post-mortem that the Republican Party allegedly did after the Romney failure didn't turn out so well for the Republican Party in its own way. But the Democratic Party has got to, these are naturally the issues that the Democratic Party should be addressing, and it will come to pass. Not only, I think, I'm less worried, frankly, about the way in which Trump will fail to deliver on the goods that his core constituency wanted, but that he will haunt and doom the lives of other Americans who are vulnerable to political persecution, to legal persecution, to deportation, to gross infringements in the criminal justice administration of criminal justice, the kinds of political persecution that he could institute are far more immediate to me than the failure, because there's no one elected could really address these questions immediately, even with a unified House and Senate. So in the short term, I'm far more worried about those other things. But I think the big mystery and I think the great burden of journalists is to wonder why they failed to understand that it was the Democratic Party that was coming apart, actually.
It's very important. Thank you very much. Danielle.
So I agree with Jill's description of the short-term worry, and that's exactly my short-term worry as well. But I think there are maybe just two brief important things to say. One is this is a space where, to quote again, I venture no predictions. We have no idea who has been impacted by this event in such a way that it will change their work as political activists. Perhaps they've never been active before. We have no idea who out there in this country right now is ready to enter into a leadership role, for example. So we are actually simply incapable of predicting what could happen in 2 years or 4 years. There's immense fluidity in the electorate. That's what we know. The difference between Iowa between 2008 and now is extraordinary. So there's immense fluidity. We can't make predictions, which means we have to define the work and the action. And I think you're completely right to be focused on state houses, governorships, and so forth. That's critical. Just see how much you can get done. That's the thing. Change the terms of the debate, change the parameters of possibility. And it's also really important there, to Jill's point, that it's not a 2-year or 4-year question. The Republicans are in the strong position that they're in because they've been working on securing state houses for a generation. And this, if one is just again analyzing the problems with Democratic Party, it's literally political malpractice what the Democratic Party has done with regard to state houses.
2 final questions.
So actually, in response to some of the things that Jill and Danielle both said, so to use an example, what now feels like a familiar situation, I was working for the former Democratic governor of Illinois, not one that went to jail, one that just lost his election. And this was in 2014 when, again, there was another Republican wave. And I remember being from the southern part of the state, the governor was from the northern part near Chicago. I remember him giving these press conferences in Chicago where he was bragging that Illinois had finally come out of the Great Recession, had reduced unemployment to 5 or 6%. And I remember being in the southern part, in the southern counties, where unemployment was 25%. And so how do, as Democrats, as leaders, how do we reconcile this growth that we are seeing in certain areas, and how do we sort of bring the folks that are being left behind along? How do we communicate with them? How do we try to bridge that gap? Because I do think that that's a big part of what's happening. I think that's what happened yesterday, is that we had the president saying, look, this is how low the unemployment rate is. This is how incomes have grown. But for millions of people, that wasn't happening. So how do we bridge that gap? And what are the ideas how do we start looking at those ideas to make that better?
Thank you. I think that question has been covered, but of course I'll turn it to the panel. Let me have the last question, please.
Hi. Thank you guys for doing this. My question is for all of you, specifically David. Following up on the idea of tech and progress, it seems like so often these days we do things in the evolution of technology just because we can. And a lot of times it seems like that goes against our interests as a human society. And so I'm wondering, and the Uber example is great, hundreds of thousands of jobs. That's what I like about Uber, is that it provides jobs to people with no barriers that wouldn't be available like that. And so I'm just wondering if perhaps it's time that we really, start filtering technology and technological advances through a lens of human society. And is it time that maybe government regulates a little bit, like what is actually okay for a human society to do from a technology perspective?
Right.
Historically, I would just volunteer that we've been here before many times. So, for instance, during the Industrial Revolution, when Henry George wrote Progress and Poverty and said, discovery after discovery, invention after invention brings us progress, so-called, but it brings us greater poverty. Mm-hmm. And there were many demands that populists in the late 19th century made for putting a brake on the acceleration of technological progress, because they argued it didn't amount to a better economic life for all, that it produced economic growth, but that to conflate economic growth and progress in the sense of the path to salvation, even in the religious sense, or progress, even the secular notion of a kind of improvement of one's life, was just a lie and a fraud. But the decision that the federal government has made at each turn has always been, unfettered invention is the key to economic growth. And economic growth, well, David can answer that. The supposition there and the counter argument was, well, we'll bring in some progressive experts and they'll take care of these social problems. They'll engineer these social problems that are attendant on technological change. And they turned out not to do that very well either. And we made that same argument all over again in the last 30 years. Would be my historical analysis here.
Danielle, I'm going to pass it on to you, and then, David, you can conclude. Yeah.
So thanks. I've been wondering a similar question, and I don't have an answer, but it's striking to me that in the context of genetic technology, we do actually have processes, sort of ethics review board processes for considering the implications, the human social implications of new technologies. And it's not that we've never done that sort of thing outside of that biological realm. So when broadcast media came online, there were, sort of FCC was actually kind of quite controlling of it with a view to sort of social impacts. And then the government took a very different stance when the internet and sort of all that unfolded. So I think it's a super interesting question. It's a really hard one, but I think it's very clear that we have let social consequences sort of happen to us rather than working to come to grips with them up front as new technological possibilities become available.
Thank you, Daniel. David, your final word from you on this question.
So regulating technology for safety and privacy, absolutely. The idea that we're going to slow down technological progress in the US because of its consequences for inequality, I think that's a very bold move, and one that poses enormous unintended consequences vis-a-vis the US in the world. So what I think we need to do, to reach back to Jill's point about progressive policymakers who haven't been so successful, we need to be better at being progressive policymakers and recognize that we are on the cusp of a social transformation that will rip our world apart if we don't address inequality. And there are tools, there are lots of tools for doing that. We can talk about the way that we build the tax system, the way that we create transfers, the way that we subsidize work. There is enormous scope to address these problems through existing policy tools. And we need to be creative and we need to be collaborative in putting those tools to work before we start turning the US into a world where technology is kind of constrained or shackled or stopped. I don't think that's going to work. But I do think that the tools that we have developed in the last century to encourage work, to give people equal opportunity, which we're not deploying now, to redistribute resources from those who have the most to those who have the least, those are the tools that I hope we'll put to use to address these problems, and I hope very quickly.
I think one of the great experiences, for me at least, of this evening is to have realized how much policy issues, how deeply policy issues have to be rethought philosophically and conceptually. So there is no division between the pragmatism of policy and the ethicality of concept. And I think that this discussion this evening has really very successfully brought that together. Quite apart from that, we've talked about analogical thinking. We've talked about the appeal of the apocalyptic, which is, of course, to do with the scale of affect. It's not so much to do with rational political thought. We have talked about inequality and the confused notion of class, which continually in this country keeps on vitiating and complicating race and gender issues and issues to do with the emancipation of women and their place. So in this important, complex, and even contradictory moment that we've experienced today, this moment where our spirits are low and yet our discourse has been high, I want to end with Gramsci's great statement and describe this moment as one of the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.